Well, I really wanted to push on the theme of what would happen if we devoted all of our research and all of our science to the betterment of the world, as opposed to making the next weapon. How much further would we be? Because what happens is every time we make a scientific breakthrough, we find a way to make a new weapon out of it. I think the world's got enough weapons.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between, or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with Paul Yantus. Paul was born and raised in Detroit. He's been married for over 30 years and has 4 children and 2 dogs. He has degrees in technology and business, and after a successful career as a technology entrepreneur, he has channeled his voracious appetite for technology and science into writing science fiction. While laid up for more than a month after a major back surgery in 2024, he jokingly told his wife that maybe he'd write a book during that time. One compelling idea later, and he did start writing. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be here.
So, I got to ask about the back surgery because that's something in my sort of repertoire, I guess, as well. So, 2021, I was laid out most of the year with back issues until I found a good physiotherapist. So, what happened and how long were you out for then?
Well, I have 2 bad discs in my back, but the second one I hurt at 9/11. I was actually in Florida at the time, but they shut down all the airports. They suggested that we drive to wherever we needed to go, and I needed to get from Florida back to Michigan, which was about a 24-hour drive. Told myself that I was going to do it in a couple of days, but every time I got to a point to stop, I'm like, I can go a little further. And I just kept going until I got there. The next morning, got up, went to the gym, and that was that. Popped a disc in my back, and I've been fighting it for 20 plus years. I ran across somebody recently who suggested this alternative surgery called TOPS, that just got approved by the FDA here. And it's an alternative to fusion. And I wanted to avoid fusion because having 2 discs, you just put pressure on the next one. It was a miracle surgery. They told me I was going to be laid up for 4 to 6 weeks. When I asked them about the recovery, they said, maybe you'll be able to walk to the refrigerator or the bathroom if you can. And, that's what led to my wife saying, what are you going to do, lying on your back for 4 to 6 weeks? And I joked that maybe I'd write a book. But the day I got back from surgery, I walked a mile and I never was actually laid up. So it wasn't the just lying around that caused me to write. It was the joke that I made to my wife prompted me to at least try.
No,
You
that's
know,
excellent.
and I wrote a chapter, and every time I wrote a chapter, I knew what the next one needed to be, and it went. I wrote the first draft of the book in 4 weeks.
Wow, that's quite good. Yeah.
Yeah, it went really fast. And I would have told you before I started writing that I didn't think I could ever write a book. Didn't think I had it in me.
Well, yeah, because what your bio says, how does someone who's never written anything longer than a press release write a book? And then you mentioned that when you graduated high school, you'd never read a book and could barely write. It sounds like
Yes,
you were
it's
coming from quite
very
a
true.
quite a spot there.
Yeah, no, actually, I was really fortunate to have my first semester in college. I had an English instructor who was like this drill sergeant, and he was going to teach us how to be college students. And he basically taught us how to study, how to read a book and take away the key points from it, and it was very, very helpful. And he taught us, how to structure our writing, and it made all the difference in the world in terms of my ability to get through college. And I've always writing's never been hard since then because I kind of had a good instructor to teach me, and but I've never written anything creative. That was, like I said, the most creative thing I wrote was probably a press release. And so, it was strange to sit down, and I always thought that, you really, really need a plot line and you need your characters really thought through. And I started with nothing other than an idea. And I Googled what, I needed, the idea was around this science team that was going to go to CERN. They were going to study microscopic black holes. It was all based on this article that I read that science suggests the universe probably shouldn't exist. And it fascinated me because it talked about the Higgs field and how it could be disrupted and everything would just vanish. And they were going to basically create a microscopic black hole if they could. And I had this idea that that would cause a minute disruption in the Higgs field and make everything around it disappear. And that was the genesis of the story. And so then I just Googled what does a team need to look like? Who would be on this team? What are their roles? And that gave me five or six characters, and I knew ultimately, what I wanted to have happen. And I knew I needed somebody to have a different set of skills, the set of skills that allow them to go on the run and survive. And so that just made up the character sets, and then you got to come up with a bad guy. And, I don't remember what prompted that. I just, a big company that wants to control the world just seemed like a really good bad guy.
It's getting a little bit of a trope nowadays because I think we're maybe too close to reality in a little ways, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to push on the theme of what would happen if we devoted all of our research and all of our science to the betterment of the world as opposed to making the next weapon. How much further would we be? Because what happens is every time we make a scientific breakthrough, we find a way to make a new weapon out of it. I think the world's got enough weapons.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely get into that a bit later, but it is one of those swords to plowshares or plowshares to swords. It goes either way, more or less, doesn't it?
Yeah, I visited London once and went to the museum. I think it was called the Museum of Armaments. And it basically showed the evolution of different methods of killing people over time. And it just got more brutal and brutal as it went along. And I'm like, wow, who thinks of this stuff?
Yeah, it's scary that there are people who's probably their job is to think of this kind of stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing. But that idea of how do we make the world a better place versus how do we create the next weapon? And these scientists, they're not trying to create a weapon. They're just trying to advance science. It just happens that even when they create it, they don't even recognize it as a weapon because
Yeah.
they don't think that way. One of the stories I really love was Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, and the idea that you take science to just that logical next step of something that's very plausible could happen, and then you think it through what happens next. And that's kind of where I was as I saw where science was at. And it's like, what if you did this? And that basically flushed out kind of where I wanted to go with the story.
Right. Because you were in the tech sector, tech entrepreneur. How did that, well, first of all, how did you get into that from your background? And then how did that influence the development of the story?
The interesting thing is I have degrees in computer science and business, and the two actually really were, having the business side and the tech side was very helpful in my career. I found myself early on in my career, I started with Kodak, and they promoted me to a corporate job where my job was to help them understand what the customer needed. What I found was techies tended to just make everything overly complicated, more complicated than it needed to be. When you could explain in their terms, listen, all you need to do is this, right? We got things done and we actually moved at a very rapid pace. And that led to leading large product teams. Ultimately took me to the West Coast where I started managing tech companies. And, I did a couple of startups, and my career is sort of a boom or bust career where I join a company, we get a really nice exit and make some money, and then I do a startup and I lose it all. I did that a couple of times, but it was fun. I have what I would describe as a pathological need to fix things. So I sought out problem businesses. I did some turnarounds and things along those lines in very high stress environments. But the more broke it was, the more I wanted to fix it. I dove into some pretty difficult environments. But it made things interesting. Out of all of that, the funny thing is that what probably led most to this was one of the guys that I work with through multiple companies, a guy by the name of Ram Rajagopalan, good friend of mine. He was always into science. It was funny. At one point, he was rooming with one of my other managers, and the other manager used to tell him he was so full of shit. He didn't understand any of this stuff, but he was always reading the latest science on this, that, and the other thing. He always found a way to work it into conversations, and I found it interesting. And found myself diving into different areas of science. And I just like, when I catch an article that says maybe we shouldn't exist, I want to read it. I just, so less to do with work, more to do with somebody I worked with is sort of what got me started into this.
Right. So are you still in the tech entrepreneur world, or have you sort of gone full
No,
author?
yeah, last fall, just before I had the back surgery and wrote the book, I decided I was done. I wasn't enjoying what I was doing, and it was time to call it a day. And my wife did not believe me. She didn't believe me till about 6 months later when she actually heard me on the phone turn down a job. Is I'm not doing that anymore. One of the things I discovered about writing was I really enjoyed it. It was fun. That I enjoyed writing, and the people who've taken the time to read it seems to enjoy what I wrote, and that makes me happy. And so life's good.
Excellent. And it sounds very much from your earlier discussion that you are a pantser for sure in your writing. You just go with what the idea is in your head,
Oh
pretty
yeah.
much.
Yep, yep, yep. I was listening to one of your podcasts and the guy was describing writers who fly by the seat of their pants, and I'm like, yeah, that's me.
So what was, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, being laid up and telling your wife the joke about maybe you should write a book. What do you remember the moment that you actually said, okay, yes, I am going to write a book? What was that sort of switch?
Well, it's funny because my when I made the comment, I had this idea for a book in my head. Okay. And it was really just an offhanded joke. But once I said it out loud, I felt obligated to at least try. I have three sisters, and I told them I was writing a book, and they basically said, "We'll believe it when we see it." I mean, they straight out did not believe I could write a book, and were quick to tell me. And so there was sort of that motivation of, "Can I do this?" But I thought the funny thing was, I had a story for another book. That about halfway through this book, I had the story for another book. I wanted to open the book with something that really happened to me. It was something that happened when I was young. It was just a story about a bunch of young guys going into the woods. I sat down and tried to write it, and I found it brutally hard to write. And this is something that actually really happened. You would think it would be much easier than but I found it is easier to just make it up.
Yeah.
So,
I imagine it's when it's something that happened, you want to capture everything as you remember it, I suppose, right? All the feelings, the emotions, and the visuals you have in your head. And I
yeah.
suppose, at least until you're more experienced, it's probably very difficult just because there's too much there, right? You have to pare it down in order for someone who's reading it to sort of process the what's happening in a kind of dramatic way, I suppose.
Well, and I've wondered since then if the reason is because it happened so long ago
Mm.
and I'm trying too hard to remember it. But I don't think it's that. I think it's just because it's something that really happened. And so you're working a different part of your brain. I think that's really it.
I was curious, we'll get onto the research in a moment once we start fully on your book, but we did discuss that you have a marketing background,
Yes.
and marketing for authors is typically one of the biggest challenges unless they are trained in marketing. Have you still found that a challenge, or has your marketing background really assisted you in promoting your book?
So it's funny, when I put my book up on Amazon, they had this video that described what you needed to do to market your book. And I was watching it and I'm thinking, they're describing my last job. It's like, I don't want to do that. And I have tried to not do the marketing myself, to ask to enlist others to do it, especially knowing that you're in a space you're not familiar with. I'm finding the fundamentals are the same. And but it's very difficult to market a book. I don't care how good your marketing skills are. There are so many books out there, and there are good books out there that aren't getting read because there's just a huge volume of them. And, it doesn't matter what you market, you have to figure out how the system works. And yeah, Amazon's got an algorithm. I don't think it's rocket science, how it works. People have found holes in it. I found this group who basically got me on a bestseller list within a week of launching the book. They knew to look for the categories that have the least amount of traffic, the one that you can fit, and they got me a burst of sales in that category. And because they're updating the bestseller list every 10 minutes, you can get on it for 10 minutes, right? And that didn't really mean much to me. I guess it does mean something for people who are looking to buy books. They see that bestseller badge, but it just seemed very artificial. And, I wanted something more sustainable. I haven't found the secret to it yet. I mean, I would love to share with authors, here's all you need to do. But I can tell you there are 100 of them out there telling you this is all you need to do. And none of them seem to be able to move the needle much. So I look at it as put good content out there. And I think word of mouth is probably the thing that matters most.
Yeah, I've been lucky and have had a few who have moved the needle quite well on the podcast, but typically it's pretty much like you just said, just keep putting content out there, and looking for your fans, your audience, and they'll, building the read through and your backlist
Uh,
essentially.
and you mentioned earlier that I'm from Detroit, and I follow the Detroit Lions. I'm diehard fan. And that when we moved to Charlotte, which is 10 hours south of Detroit, I was surprised to find a very large group of Lions fans here. And so we all get together during game days. And a couple of weeks ago, one of them had a birthday, and I went out to the birthday party. And this one guy came up to me who was in the group, and he had read my book, and he was just loved my book. And he wanted to talk about what comes in the sequel, which I loved because he was like, let me guess what's going to happen, and everything he guessed was wrong, which actually I really liked because I like to not go where the reader thinks you're going to go. And so that made me happy. But it was really interesting. And I was just about to go on vacation, and he suggested a book to me, the Hail Mary book. I don't know if you read that one. It's by the guy who wrote The Martian. Oh, it was a great book, but it's you know to me, that's how people find out about good books is from somebody else who read them that like has similar interests and shares something, and when you get that going, it makes all the difference in the world.
Right, the word of mouth, yeah. Because you have some good reviews on yours, which is a challenge for authors. Do you have any secret to doing that, or did it just happen organically?
Most of it happened organically. I think some of the feedback that I got on the negative side is something a little bit expected of I intentionally didn't go deep with some of the characters. I read a lot of books over time. And one of the things that I always found was when you watch the movie, it always disappoints. But part of it is because the way you imagine the character shapes who that person is in your head. And I wanted people to picture the character not based on how I described it, but based on watching what they're doing in the book and creating their own mental image of it. And so I was reluctant to go real deep into what these characters look like and what their mannerisms were, and try to leave it to the reader to fill in some of the blanks. I've gotten criticized for that, but I really do think that you create your own vision of who these characters are, and that's a good thing. You know, I told you how I created the characters earlier, right? I mean, I didn't put that much thought into it to begin with. And so I really wanted the reader to think about who these characters are. From their own background, you all come up with your own point of view.
Right. So it kind of does, I mean, it's a thriller, and we'll get into it almost in a moment, but it feels like you had a movie running through your head when you were
Yeah.
writing this, basically, because it is a thriller. When I was reading it, it felt like something that someone would put on the screen.
Well, it was funny. I think that's partly because I've consumed so much fiction over time, both reading and watching it. So you have a sense of how a story should evolve. I've been told that I seem like I rushed to the end of the book, but part of it was I wanted it to move fast. I always loved books where I like James Patterson, where his chapters are really short
Hmm.
because I get interrupted frequently, and it's nice to be able to get to the end of a chapter, to be able to set it down and go do something and come back to it. And I never like to stop. I always found it hard to stop in the middle of a chapter. and then try to pick it back up. So, I wanted short chapters. I wanted things that moved along quickly, but I also got stuck in the middle of the book. It was the only time that I had a break where I didn't know what I was going to write next. And it was funny because I was sitting at the dinner table and I mentioned this to my youngest son. I said, I've kind of hit writer's block. He said, "Do you know how the story ends?" I said, "Yeah, I think I do." He said, "Write the ending. See if you can write the ending and then connect where you're at to it." And I did. I wrote an ending and that got me unblocked. Once I got unblocked, I was a bit in a rush to get to the end because I had it fleshed out what the end was, right? It turned out I didn't use that ending. I scrapped that ending altogether and I deemed it implausible and came up with a different ending that I really liked. Then I gave the book to beta readers and they all came back and none of them liked my ending. But the weird part was they all had a different problem with it. It was not the same. Everybody came back with something different. I had a good editor that I worked with. When she was done editing the book, I asked her, "What do you think of the book?" She said, "I really like the book, but I don't like your ending." I said, "Well, what don't you like about the ending?" She says, "You wrapped everything up. There's nothing left for the reader." I was like, "Yeah, that's okay." I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning and I called the editor up and I said, "I want to add one line." And I told her what the line was. She's like, "Oh, that's good." I added the one line at the end of the book. I think you've read the book, so you know
Yeah,
what the
yeah.
line is. It caused me to probably rework about, I added maybe 5 sentences before it, and that was it. I really didn't change my ending. I just added that last piece. And that seemed to make all the difference in the world in terms of how satisfied people felt at the end of the book. They needed something at the end of the book to look for next. And that then put me on the hook to write a sequel. And I have started writing the sequel, and I've written enough of it to know kind of where it's going. But when I wrote the book, I had no idea of a sequel in my head, and it wasn't until I wrote that line that I kind of knew where I would take a sequel to. And writing a sequel is its own journey, I've found. It's the funny thing was I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who the villain should be because the villain in the first book goes away. So you need a new villain in the second book, right? I went back to Jurassic Park. If you think about Jurassic Park, who's the villain in the second book or the third book or the fourth book? It's always the dinosaur.
It's interesting that you brought up Jurassic Park because I did have that thought as I was reading it as well, thinking about the story that there were elements there, like the use of technology and stuff. But what I was wanting to comment on here is your beta readers. It's quite an interesting
Yes.
idea that you have, and I have heard quotes about this before. The one I always remember is if everyone tells you something's wrong with a part of your book, they're probably right. But when they try to
Yep.
tell you what it is, they're probably wrong. So you could tell something was not working with the ending, but you had like what half a dozen to a dozen different ideas of what it might be. And you
Yeah.
chose your own path, which seemed to solve everything because you know the story better than anyone inherently.
Well, I really liked my ending, and so I didn't want to change it. I really felt like when I wrote the ending that I nailed the ending. And so when people told me they had a problem with it and they were kind of all over the place, I was reluctant to change it. Even when the editors said that, it made me think about it. When I would tell you before I went to sleep, I wasn't planning on changing the book. But I do have a lot of my best ideas come when I go to sleep and my mind can rest a little bit. And then the next morning I know what I want to do. And that worked out. The hardest part was between the original draft that I wrote. While I was writing, I reached out to a friend who's an author out west, and she basically said that you should get people who you don't know to read your work while you're working on it to give you recommendations to improve your writing. So I joined a local writing group and I shared a couple of chapters that I was writing. And I said, one of the things that I'm really struggling with is dialogue text. I'm used to writing like a press release, the CEO said, and then he went on to say, and that's basically all he really put on for dialogue text, right? And this he said, she said, there's a lot of dialogue in the book, and it seems very redundant. And they said, "Oh, you don't need to do that." The advice was that you don't need to do that. Once you establish who's talking, you just break it apart into paragraphs and the reader will be able to follow it. I remember making the comment, well, what happens if there are like three or four people talking? And they said, well, you can't do that.
Just don't do it.
Like, that doesn't work. I took that advice and I basically took out all the dialogue tags in the book. And it became even hard for me to follow who was saying what. Once I finished writing the first draft of the book, I reached out and I found this established author by the name of Sam Jones, who writes mystery detective style novels. He worked with me and we went back and we did that. But the comment that people had made at that point was, you need to do less telling and more showing. And I really didn't understand what that meant until I worked with Sam. Sam did a really good job of helping me understand that you have to describe what the person looks like and what they're doing as they're saying these things. A lot of conversations in the book occur in a car. And he would always come back and say, you've already said that a couple of times. Don't use that again. Come up with something new. And it's like, I don't, yeah, what else can they do? They pounded their hands on the steering wheel. It does, facial expressions, the tone of their voice, mannerisms, and stuff like that. Adding those in really made it read so much better. I could tell just from the first couple of chapters that we did together how much it was rounding out what I was writing. And we went through that process. And we got probably about halfway through the book, and it was like, okay, I got this now. I know what I'm doing. But it was incredibly helpful to have somebody who kind of knew what they were doing to help me with my writing.
So did you always intend to self-publish then, or did you think you might look for an agent and a publisher and all that stuff?
I self-published because Sam suggested that that was the way to go with it. If, and I think part of it is as a first-time author, I've been told that it's really hard to get an agent or a publisher to take you seriously. It's, you have to write a few things before they really want to deal with you. And when I wrote it, I didn't write it for the world. I wrote it for me. It was one of these things where I enjoyed doing it and I wrote it. I was a little reluctant to let anybody read it. The reason why I enlisted Sam was I wanted to make it at least good enough to where I felt like I could let somebody else read it. And I didn't really know if people would like it. I was surprised by the response I got. The process of writing, I just really enjoy. The story just sort of came out and it was fun. It was fun to think about what happens next and where are they going to go and how to not make it predictable so that it doesn't always go where you expect it to go and things along those lines. And so, it was, but I didn't when I wrote it, like I said, I wasn't really anxious to share it with the world. Publishing it on Amazon, Sam suggested that I do that. I did it. If I had to do it all over again, I definitely would have thought through the marketing before publishing. I just put it out there and, maybe people will find it. And you realize, yeah, nobody is going to find it. So, and then I've tried different marketing approaches. I'm getting a better feel for what works and what doesn't work and have a better idea. But I think that there's a pre-promotion of a book that needs to be done that I completely skipped. Telling people about what you're doing and getting them anxious to at least see it, I think is really helpful. And I had
Like
no
a
build up.
coming soon type of thing.
Yeah, there was no build up to it. I find myself doing the same thing right now with that. I wrote a children's book. We rescued these two dogs and they're like opposites of each other. One dog just she's like crazy go all the time, wants to be with every dog on the planet. The other dog's afraid of the world. The outgoing dog really wants to play with the other dog, but the other dog's afraid of everything, including her. And watching her try to get the other dog to play and trying different things and ultimately succeeding, I was like, there's a really good story here for kids, about how to deal with kids who aren't like you and how to adapt to the situation and make a friend, and that was, and so I wrote it and it's been illustrated and they're actually in the throes of coloring it right now, which is its own interesting experience. But again, I'm going to throw it out to the world and hope somebody reads it. I have no plan for it. It's just something that happened, but it just seemed like a really nice story. My wife works with kids in the school, and it's just one of those, a book should be entertaining, and also, especially a children's book, should help them be a better person, you
Right.
know?
So, although it appears you don't follow your own advice on this, what would be sort of one thing that you would recommend prior to book launch that someone should do? If there was like just one, if you just had to pick out one thing regarding the marketing.
I think that you really need to be out about, my guess is somewhere around 6 months before you publish a book, of teasing it and getting people interested in something that's coming. I mean, it's just like when we go to a movie and they show us the movie previews, right? It's because people start to talk about it. I think that getting people to talk about something that's coming, the thought of it coming is actually powerful. It can build some momentum going into it. Sam mentioned to me that as an established author, he's got the advantage of, he's written a series of books all about the same character. And so people are looking for the next book. And so he's got an established audience looking for the next script. I don't have an established audience because it's my first book, right? And so you really have to find a way to let people know that you're doing it and get them interested in being a part of it. Because even friends and family, they're not prepared for you to just one day deliver a book, and people don't stop their lives because you wrote a book. Yeah, my wife's my favorite. She's like, I'm way too busy to read this. She said, but if you create an audiobook, I will listen to it in the
Yeah.
car. That's why I have an audiobook. It's the only way I was going to get my wife to actually take in the story. Yeah, I do think that whole idea of kind of teasing it coming, which takes effort to market, and it does take you away from the writing process. But I think that actually, if you think about teasing it too, it also will shape your story a little bit too,
Yeah.
about what people are really going to latch onto versus what you're spending time on. Because sometimes we spend times as writers on stuff that ends up being filler as opposed to what people really want,
Or you
right? And
chop it
it,
out completely, right?
yeah, and it helps you keep your eye on the ball of what people are really interested in, because when you market it, it's really kind of grabbing the theme of what they're going to be interested in and promoting that, right? And that's also allows you to shape your ads as well. I'm not overly happy right now with some of the ads that I have because I don't think that they grab you the way that they should, because it is as much science fiction as thriller, right? It's a blend of both, and it's a book that's based on science, and it's based on something that doesn't exist, but it's got that thriller element to it as well. And that was, Crichton was one that I really liked how he combined those aspects of it.
Have you seen whether the audience from one genre or the other has picked up on it more?
It's been a little of both, people who are really I have the friend who I mentioned who was into science. He just loved the physics in the book. He just thought, he couldn't believe that I did that much research. And it's like, I probably did less research than you think I did. He loved the science in the book. And I've had a lot of people come in and they really got into the science part. And I've had other people that just really got into the characters and the ride. And those are the ones that I think seek the sequel more so than the ones who really got into the science. To me, I wanted to entertain. I wanted a book that just would be fun to read, but also made you think about what happens if this actually happens, because it could. And having it based in some reality, I think really makes it just more real to the reader. And so that was kind of fun too.
Excellent. So we probably should actually get into your book a little bit. It is called Black Void, Nowhere to Run, is the subtitle, which already kind of suggests to me a sequel anyway, even if you hadn't already mentioned it a few times. As we said, it is a thriller, and I think you've mentioned, so it features a team of scientists who have gone to the CERN Large Hadron Collider to study micro black holes, basically. And there is a segment within this story that is worried you might be destroying the world that way, which we'll get to as well. And then it is, like I say, primarily a thriller. It features a lot of dramatic, modern, I guess you could call them, I don't want to use the term tropes because that kind of cheapens it a little bit. But you have some interesting characters that are, let's say, popular type of characters as well. I don't
Sure.
know if you wanted to add anything to that to sell it a bit better.
I mean, the main character is a female scientist, which it's hard to be a female scientist. So 80% of scientists are men.
I think
And
that depends on the
it's
field.
yeah, well, physicists and CERN has always been very interesting to me. I actually went there on vacation to go check it out. I would highly recommend that if you're in Geneva, it's worth the time. They don't let you down into the tunnels, but what they do show you is amazing. I've been amazed at how many people are unfamiliar with it, that they don't even know it exists. I had this idea for the main character that she was the granddaughter of Lise Meitner, who was basically instrumental in creating the discovery of nuclear fusion. If you look at the team that discovered nuclear fusion, she was the only physicist on the team, and she was the brilliant mathematician. It was actually the chemist who won the Nobel Prize because back then they weren't giving Nobel Prizes to women. That sort of played into this whole there's a woman in the lead and she is going to redeem her grandmother. She has this motivation to go do this. And the team itself was what you need in a team. One of the key characters on this team is a computer scientist because you need somebody with really good computer skills to do simulations. It takes some serious programming capabilities on the team to do some of the things that they try to do. That character had a skill set that lent itself to things that I needed in terms of advancing the thriller portion of the book as well. So not only just the science. Some of the characters carry over really well to the second book. You've got one character on the team, particularly whose job it is to play devil's advocate, because in the book, CERN is concerned that you could destroy the world if you're not careful with what you're trying to do. They're trying to create a black hole. Okay, they're not trying to create a large black hole. They're trying to create a microscopic black hole. And part of what led me to that was an experiment that was done at CERN that created, I think it was 7 trillion Kelvin, which is hotter than the center of the sun. Makes you wonder how could you do that and not destroy the place, right? Well, what it was is they measured a spark off a particle collision.
Right.
It was a spark that existed for a moment and then disappeared, but it was so hot that it was hotter than anything on the Earth or even in our solar system. And so the idea is that you could, for a moment, create a black hole. What you need to create a black hole is an enormous amount of heat, and you need to introduce mass to it. And you'll create a vacuum. So if you could predict that spark and introduce mass at the same time, you could theoretically create a vacuum that would appear like a microscopic black hole. And then you could study what happens with it. But it's all going to happen in like a fraction of a second. And because it would happen that way, there would be no harm. The lead physicist, that's his theory. His math proves it out there to prove that this theory is reality. And CERN looks at it and says, yeah, it should work. So we're going to give you the license to try, but we would like to see some guardrails around it. They recruit members of the team to make sure that this doesn't get out of control and that they don't do something that destroys the world. That made sense to me. You wouldn't want somebody to prove their theories without any real guardrails around what they're trying to do, especially when they're trying to do something like this. But that whole concept made sense to me. Where I got stuck was the nowhere to run. Let's just say that you create this thing and you don't want to give it to anybody. Where do you go? Because every government in the world is going to want it. Where is safe? The only place that you would think is safe is CERN. you
Even then,
know,
I wouldn't really think it's
yeah,
safe.
yeah, and that was the point where I got stuck. I knew the story up to that point, and I kind of knew what should happen afterwards, but I really didn't. Where do you run to? Was really the tough thing. I won't spoil it for people listening, but I think that was the hard part. It's not trying to do this because I think ultimately somebody will try very much to do this very same thing. But what if you're successful People are going to want this and not for good purposes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And definitely getting into that. I was curious though, you did, because I was going to ask you about your research first. And you did mention that you visited CERN, but they didn't let you down in the tunnels then, because that's quite an interesting. I haven't been to CERN, but I've been to a few other synchrotrons, and well, for some of the work I was doing back in the day. But yeah, it's quite interesting in the tunnel area for sure.
Oh yeah, no, I did a bunch of research around CERN, and that was one of the things that when I was working with Sam, he was like, you need to describe this. And it's like, wow, this is hard to describe. It's so enormous. And that was, the more I researched, the more fascinated I got by the place. The science, the research on the science side, I said, started with this article about the Higgs field potentially being easy to disrupt. And that led me to how it got created and also what could disrupt it. And they both led me to the same place, black holes. They theorized that the Higgs field was created by microscopic black holes at the beginning of time. And if you look at what potentially could disrupt it, a bubble in a black hole is a simple way to disrupt this thing. Not that we're going to run into a black hole anytime soon, but the nature of a black hole led itself to being easily able to disrupt this thing. It's not just what holds us together; it's what holds everything together.
Right,
Together,
yeah.
this invisible field that is basically allowing all these molecules in our body to be held together, but everything we see, everything that exists, that one small disruption and everything just goes away is just frightening. The thought that it could be disrupted by any number of things, but the research kept going back to black holes, especially this idea of a microscopic black hole, which I had never even thought about until I started reading on this. When you think of a black hole, you think of these supermassive black holes, but they're, potentially are much smaller ones that exist and disappear, that don't have a shelf life that's real long because it's basically just a vacuum in space.
Right. So I did want to stay on the research part for one more moment, because
Sure.
did you then how did you research the travel as well? So through I'm imagining Google Earth, but did you actually drive the path, or did you sort of, because I've been
Oh,
researching stuff in the US for some of my stories, and I Google Earth is a great friend, but
well, I'm glad you asked that actually. So I've spent a fair amount of time in Europe for my work. I've run businesses over there. Actually, on the trip that I just took, Torino is a place where I ran a business out of, and I knew the area. I would visualize the type of locations that people would meet, especially like in Geneva. They were going to have a team meeting, and they'd want it to be in a nice place where you could have a table and everybody could get to know each other. I picked out this place called the Casablanca, but it happens in January, right? And so they're on the lake and it's just brutally cold. They've got this nice restaurant that they go to. And I actually, in this trip that I just took, I went to these places. It's funny because the thing that drove me crazy was I did research them through like Google Earth and things along those lines, but I picked very specific locations so that I could visualize myself because I'd been there. And then I picked locations in that geography that fit the story. And the one that drove me absolutely crazy was I referenced Pickwick Pub. It's actually called Mr. Pickwick, but these are all real places. Pickwick was in the right location for where I needed it to be. I wanted a bar that was out of the way where they could meet and not be at risk of running into anybody on this team. And it was far enough off the beaten track to fit that narrative. And what was driving me crazy is there's a scene that actually happens in the alley behind the Pickwick. And every bar that I've ever seen has an alley behind it with a dumpster, and this one does not. It drove me crazy. It's like, where is the dumpster? And I had to go there and see for myself. It's kind of crazy to show up at a bar and want to know where their dumpster's at. But it just they don't have an alley behind the bar, and they basically pick up trash in a different location. But it was one that just fit the story perfectly, except for it didn't have an alley behind the bar.
right.
But yeah, all the way down to, at one point, the one character has to get onto the train tracks, and finding a method to get onto the actual tracks at the main station in downtown Geneva. I researched it down to, okay, if I were going to do it, this is how I would get there. A location where he could actually climb up, get over the fence, and get onto those tracks. I researched every piece of it. He falls asleep in the train. Where does he wake up? And it was fun, kind of picking all the different places in the story. But the story is naturally set to begin in Geneva because that's where CERN's at. And then if you have to run, where do you run? I went south mainly because I know the south better than I know north of there, even though I do know north of there as well. But yeah, it would just seem like the right way to go.
I was wondering as well. So you mentioned that you did start with quite a cast of characters, the scientific team. I'm trying not to do spoilers, but let's say you pare down the team a little bit at some point. Was that
Yeah.
to simplify storytelling and just be for dramatic effect? Did you get bored of the characters?
It was more for dramatic effect than it was. I wasn't bored of the characters. I felt like to really drive home what was happening that needed to happen. The funny part is not that part, but the character who's in the prologue.
Right. Yeah, I was
What
about him as
happens
well.
with him? Because a lot of people who read the book before they got too far with it assumed that he was the main character in the book. And we're surprised when he disappears for a while and he comes back later and just sort of how that plays out. And particularly my youngest son, I was basically proofing the audio for the audio book. And he heard a chapter that was far ahead of where he was in the book. He's like, that can't happen. It's like, yeah, it can.
Yeah, I was curious. And again, I don't want to get into spoilers for this or the sequel, but it is written as if he is one of the main characters, and then something
Well,
unexpected happens to him.
the funny part was that I started writing, and of course, like I said, I had to go research this team, right? And who's on the team, and what are the members of this team? What are their roles? What do they do? And develop characters around them, right? I found that it's a pretty sizable team, and so in order to introduce all those characters, I'm now 3, 4 chapters into the book, and I'm like, I mean, this is not going to grab somebody and make them stay. There's too much character development going on here. I need to find something that grabs you and gets you into the story. And so I stepped back and I wrote the prologue as a way to set up the bad guy in the book, which I think a lot of people miss initially, is what I'm trying to really communicate to the reader is how bad this bad guy can actually be, right? He's helping a guy out of a gambling debt. And how does he deal with the bookie? That gives you, because it would be very easy to just pay off the guy, right? But he doesn't. That was the whole point, was to pull you into the story and say this is actually going to be really interesting. Also to give you this idea of the bad guy is really bad. He's got no regard for human life whatsoever. That then bought me time to do the introduction of the other characters, where I've fed you something that gave you the action that you wanted. So now I can spend a little bit of time helping you understand who the key characters are in this book.
So we have mentioned the bad guy, the entity that is the bad guy, a few times. I don't think it's a spoiler. Would it be a spoiler to say it's a mega corporation? Is that
Yeah, no,
it comes out in the first?
like part of what I had in my mind was, Italy, even to this day, has a lot of families that run different parts of large conglomerates in the country. I had a friend who was Italian who said, if you think back of the US and the railroad barons and how they dominated everything in the country for a while, that's how he described kind of how Italy was. And I always had that thought in my mind of this family that controls this enormous conglomerate, and I thought really just kind of makes a bad guy. It's a conglomerate, it's not a person so much, but it's an entity that basically is not in it for the pure science, but they show up as the sheep, not the wolf. And I think that there's still a lot of that in today's society.
I think there's
So,
a lot more than most people are willing to accept. If you've read Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, she paints a pretty strong picture that, let's say, organized crime and the political system, especially in the US, but I highly doubt that it's localized to the US, have been in cahoots since at least World War II and probably World War One. It seems to me pretty clear they are still today, but
well, that's
we'll see.
I think in the US here, it's like 1% of the people have 80% of the money, and that's tells you a lot of what you need to know.
Yeah.
So,
And so I guess it kind of becomes a moot question as to why do you think it is the megacores don't use their wealth and the, like to the billionaires don't use their wealth to actually shore up the fundamental needs of people, but let's say keep on with their pet projects as it is.
yeah, I think part of it is you didn't, from most people who are newly rich, okay, didn't get there by wasting any money. They really thought about every dime that they spent and what they spent it on, and they worked really hard to get there. And so you're reluctant to you're driven for a specific thing and you can't see the field from the trees. And having been an entrepreneur, I can understand. You described to me once that money is like air in a startup. If you run out, you die. And you really need to think about every dollar and how you're going to raise the next dollar. And it gets so hard to build something from the ground up that when you do it, it teaches you to not use money for any other purpose other than the mission that you're on at the moment. And the problem is, I think that gets ingrained into everyone around you. When you ultimately do get rich, you still are mission driven, and you don't really think about anything outside of your mission. I think that's unfortunate, but I think it also gets ingrained into everybody around you. And they see what you're doing and they want to emulate it. Philanthropic is not the thought of how to better other people, it's how to achieve the mission. And you see a lot of that with a lot of rich people, especially the newly rich because of what it took to get there,
Yeah.
and it's it's not right. It just is, you
Is it
know.
is it a bit of a catch
So,
22 in some ways? Because like I agree with how you describe, let's say, the new rich as well, as opposed to the older rich, where they do have to worry about, each dime, as we say, through their journey up. And would that not maybe also, and this is difficult to say either way, but you then, let's say if you give a lot to people who don't have that concern, they may not respect it and they may begin to just expect that you're going to give them whatever that, and they become sort of lazy, which is something I think we do see. Let's say
yeah,
you see it in
well,
multiple generations down the road, and you also see it in a generation that has grown up with a lot of luxuries that we didn't have when we were younger, for example.
I think that's part of what, when you do succeed and you do have money, you see people are living off of somebody else's achievement. And you look at it and say that, giving them money is not driving them, and so, it makes you even more reluctant to give money to somebody, right? It's like I was driven because I didn't have money. And I can relate to this in the sense of when just before I graduated college and when I met my wife, I was running a computer lab at the university and I didn't have enough money to eat. And my wife would buy me food and bring it to me. I was just thin as a rail. And when I graduated, I had zero money and no place to go. And, that it drives you. And when you're driven like that, you think others should be like you. And it takes a long time before you learn that everybody's different. That everybody's not like you. But people tend to look at other people through their eyes and think that they should be like you. And the world's full of all kinds of different people. And discovering that is actually makes the world a better place. It does.
I think one of the things that we're coming to face right now as well, along this lines, both as a nation and as, let's say, individuals within the in the core, because the contrary opinion to my perspective I just presented is the idea that on your way up, you'll often step on people to get there. Maybe not consciously. Countries will abuse other countries to gain wealth. And then you say, well, why don't they pull themselves up like we pulled ourselves up? And you're like, well, that's because you pushed them into the dirt, basically. So there's these two perspectives. And personally, I haven't yet reconciled how to manage those responsibilities, I suppose, because you have the two different perspectives. And I still sort of trying to work through it myself. But clearly, when you succeed, I guess it would make sense that you feel some responsibility to help others as well.
You know, I I agree that when you succeed, you should feel a responsibility to help others. And that to me, giving back's always been important. But it's the earlier part of that comment I wanted to respond to, which is, stepping on somebody to get forward. I'd like to think that, I'd like to think that I didn't do that. Okay, that and to be successful in my career, I achieved my success by working hard and trying to do the right thing. I like to think that, right? But I ran into a guy who I reached out to. I don't remember if it was to read the book or it was something recently, who I knew early in my career, and he couldn't believe I reached out to him because I took an opportunity from him. And what it was we were both in the same position in a company, and I got promoted and he didn't, but he saw it as I took something from him, that he should have gotten. You know, I it never even occurred to me, that if you get a promotion, that means somebody else didn't, and there are a lot of things that happen in your life where something good happens to you, but actually there's a consequence of that good thing didn't happen to somebody else. You tend to see things through your own eyes, and where I felt like I earned that, he felt like he deserved it more. And still 20 years later holds it against me.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, I never even knew that.
It's one of those difficult situations, isn't it? You're focused on your own life, and then you don't sometimes, yeah, like you say, you don't even see how someone else interprets
Yeah.
your journey, basically.
Well,
Um,
it's funny. I have my best friend who I've known since I was 2 years old. We went on a vacation. We went out to LA and we got into this. I bet you didn't know with each other, just sharing things from our childhood that you knew, but the other person didn't know. And at one point, he drops on me, I was really hurt when you went to college. And I'm like, really? I said, why? And he said, because it felt like you were running away from me. And I said, I was running away, but not from
for
you.
you.
And I said, I thought if anybody in the world would have understood, it would have been you. But you never shared it with each other. And so you never saw it through each other's point of view. And this is somebody who is close to me as a brother, who I just could have never imagined that he would have seen it that way. But it is, you see things through your own point of view. And even those close to you don't see things the same way you do.
Yeah, yeah. And we could go on this discussion upwards or downwards spiraling, but let's bring it back to something a little more fun
Yes.
and sci-fi. And I was wondering if this story is set in an alternate universe. Now, there was a bunch of things around this. I say this because of the company and the news network they mentioned at
Oh yeah, yeah,
one
yeah,
point.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But regarding the black holes with CERN, so one of the issues, now I don't know how new or old the article you read was, but I was looking into this because I remember people, of course, the conspiracies, right? Oh, it's going to create black holes that are going to destroy the Earth. And this was actually put forward early on. So I guess the Large Hadron Collider came online in 2008. And around the same time, there was a professor, Tübingen University, Otto Rosler, who put forward this particular idea. And then there's the conspiracy theory to take it one step further that actually the black hole was created, destroyed the world, and we're living in an alternate world.
I
So
haven't
I'm
heard that
wondering if
one.
any of this entered or whether that was an alternate world in the story, and you have any sort of thoughts
Uh,
on developing
yeah,
this?
yeah, no, I do think that's an interesting concept. I have seen a lot of stories about basically we're living in a dream world, that it's just our consciousness creating this world around us. I think that's a really interesting one to explore, but it wasn't. For me, that was not what I was exploring. Somebody made a comment early on when I first published the book that they thought I did a really good job of world building. And it's like, I didn't know I was building a world. I thought it was the world we live in. I do find, like I said, I wanted it based in a certain sense of reality so that you could insert yourself into it, where you can envision yourself in this situation and what would you do? Because a lot of it for me writing it was doing exactly that. It's like, okay, you get this set of characters and this is what happened. What did they do next? And that was the fun of writing it is you got both the good guys and the bad guys, and you're basically thinking about, okay, what are they going to do? I mean, because if you're the bad guy and you have all the money in the world, right, you can do certain things, right? I mean, and nothing's really beyond what you can spend money on. On the other side, you got this group of people who are very limited amount of resources who have to figure out how to get away and get away to where, and it's got its own challenges, but to a certain extent, it writes itself when you start to think about, okay, they're going to do this, and then you're going to go do this, and you're hoping to achieve this, and they're hoping to achieve that. And where I end up, it's sort of how would people behave ultimately if you end up in this situation? And when I say people, I mean even governments, right? You know, because towards the end, it gets very public, right? And so they need to be sensitive about how the world sees them, behave around this situation, but their motivation hasn't changed.
Right.
Their motivation's still the same, but they have to check their behavior because the world's not watching, and yeah, it's much easier to behave badly when the world's not watching.
Yeah.
It's
You have, I mean, the getting away part is interesting because you call on, let's say, a technophilic person of some skill, but that's the sort of the third group you bring in then. So you have the evil megacore group, which you introduce very early on in the book. Then you have what I would argue are, I might be using this word too much. So you've got the scientists, the hyper-focused scientists, and this tends to be an issue. So my background is in science, and that part is highly accurate in that quite often scientists don't worry about the consequences of their work.
yes,
And then you also have then the what I would call the naive do-gooders in some ways is a group. So that's an interesting one because two of these groups don't really seem to understand the consequences of what they have.
yes,
Um, it is unfortunately, perhaps sadly accurate, maybe like with the scientists I already mentioned, but also with the do-gooders not being able to realize that they would be potentially viewed as bad guys with this technology, even
yes.
let's say without giving any spoilers, even after what they use it for.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing too, is after that point, they don't understand the consequence of their actions, that they're now viewed in a different light because they've done something that the world doesn't like, right? And regardless of how just their cause might be, they're seen in a different light, and so you have the how the outside world starts to see this comes in towards the end of the book. Up until that point, it's very micro focused on we need to get out of this situation. But when you step back and think about how the world sees this, it's different than what the characters expect. That creates its own challenge. And I thought that, I found a clever way out, which again, I wrote a different ending, a completely different ending to this book. I guess I can give away the alternative ending because I'm never going to publish it anyway. What I wanted them to do was use this to force other nations to disarm because it's a big threat. I had this idea of how they could take this and basically make it so that if you don't do this, we can make your capital disappear. But it seemed implausible. The more I played that out, I remember running the whole concept by my oldest son, and he was like, "Yeah, I can't see that happening. It was too far, a step too far." So I had to figure out where do you go with this.
Yeah.
And like I said, I found a clever solution that works for everybody, but that will only carry you so far. But it is the outside world's pressure on what happens next, right? Because the world has become aware of this situation in a way that basically makes them watch what happens next.
Yeah.
And so now everybody's got to check themselves for a moment. That actually creates a moment where things can end in a different way.
Yeah, because it speaks a lot to sort of the public view of a lot of the modern social justice groups. Not only social justice, but even some of the environmental groups are very disruptive. And clearly they have a focus and something in their mind and the way that they're proceeding and the way they think they should be viewed. But for example, your alternate ending to me sounds absolutely horrendous, not from a storytelling point of view, but you've essentially, from my perspective, created the most gruesome terrorist organization in the world, basically.
Well, yeah, and the funny part is that it gets created by somebody who wants to get people to stop making scientists make weapons.
Yeah, that's exactly that. That's the irony. That's the great irony,
Yeah,
isn't it? And that type of thing happens too often, right? I mean, we criticize some of the environmental groups for doing things that actually contribute to environmental
right.
pollution in many ways.
It's like the extreme that you have to go to get to that place is just too extreme.
Well, it's just
You,
as bad as the issue itself, isn't it?
you become worse than the bad guy.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we're getting towards the end of our time. I had two questions which are kind of related. The first one is then, well, one revolves around the technology, and then one is about the synchrotrons themselves. I'm quite curious about. So let's go with the technology then. You have at the ending a use that they put the technology to for humanitarian purposes. And
Yes.
so without, let's say, avoiding that particular purpose, what other positive uses could you see for this? And incidentally, I wanted to mention that I hadn't thought of this until today at lunch. For some reason, I put on the DreamWorks movie Home. I don't know if you've ever seen it with the little purple
Yeah.
guys that they call the Boov. And
Yeah, I'm not sure I've seen that one.
they have these little bubble guns when they take over the Earth. Now they take it over for the best of intentions because they don't even think about humans as really being evolved much, and they're running away from these bad guys. So, but when they come on, they have these weapons where they can just disappear walls, they can shoot little bubbles at them and stuff, or accidentally blow up gas stations and stuff. But it reminded me of basically the weapon that's in your book. So, but what positive uses could such a device be put to other than the one you mentioned in the book? Can you think of anything?
Well, it's funny. So when I was thinking about the sequel, and I don't use this in the sequel, so I can give this one away. I had this idea of a meteor hurling towards Earth, right? And creating this black hole that basically takes it away before it actually hits, right? It could absorb it before it does any damage. You can come up with combinations like that really kind of work avoid. You could use it as a defensive mechanism of taking in a bomb before it goes off and absorbing the impact so that it has no impact on civilization. There's ways to use it as a defensive mechanism, but it would require a lot of explanation of how you pull it off. Plus, I think that the whole idea of a meteor hurling towards Earth has really been played out at this point. So it
Well,
didn't.
we'll see, I guess, when the next couple come in a few years.
Yeah.
So, did you have any other ideas? I'm curious, or is that sort of the main defensive kind
Well,
of?
that was the first idea of using it as a defensive mechanism to take away things that could do a lot of damage.
Right.
The interesting thing is, if you really think through the device itself, right, it is something that's so small that you can get it anywhere. And it leaves no trace that it ever existed when it's done, other than the damage it leaves behind. So it is the ultimate stealth weapon. But if you take that and you start looking at, okay, how can we do something good with it, right? You can really start looking at how do you take something that's a danger and make it go away,
Right.
and there's no consequence to where it goes because we don't even know where it goes.
Yeah. You got to sort of snuck through the cracks on that
Yeah.
one. The whole conservation of matter thing. But that was
Well,
something that occurred to me is the way you described it, because I kept thinking black hole, black hole. You usually think a black hole is an incredibly concentrated mass. You think of it as drawing things in. In your case, that's not really how it's described. And the way you describe it
no.
as the disruption of the Higgs field being triggered by micro black holes makes me think of a matter dematerializer almost. You're basically just
Right.
breaking apart matter. So it's not so much psychologically thinking it as a black hole, but as a disruptor of matter entirely, isn't it?
But and not to just to reveal too much of what comes in the sequel, but when you take energy, energy doesn't go away. So if you absorb it, it has to go somewhere.
Hmm.
Okay. And there are some indications of what happens to the energy that goes into a black hole that scientists have just begun to start to understand, and so it isn't the wormhole that people think. Energy doesn't go away, even when it goes into a black hole.
Right. Your comment makes me think maybe there's going to be a climate change angle or something.
Yeah. Well, taking all the bad stuff and throwing it into a black hole is not a solution.
Exactly. So the final question I had then, I was putting our futurism hats on. Now, ignoring the black hole slash matter dematerializer, we've got synchrotrons all over the world. So we've got the Large Hadron Collider. I looked this up. There's 16 synchrotrons in the United States. There's like a half a dozen in Germany, half a dozen in Sweden. There's a whole bunch in France as well. If the world collapsed, what would we do with these? What do you think would happen with these synchrotrons? And there's two possibilities. Like, let's say the energy grid continued to exist, or the energy grid was completely shut down.
But that's really interesting. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I don't have a good answer for that.
Something I was
Okay.
thinking, so if you come up with something, definitely say
Yeah.
it, shout it out. Because I was thinking, okay, you've got authoritarians, humanitarians, and scavengers. I mean, for me, like if I lived anywhere in the vicinity of one, I'm like getting my buddies and going down there and using it as an underground fortress, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they would make a good underground fortress. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's assume that basically that happens, and the scientists are in there. The scientists that are going to go very hard at work to try to come up with the solution using what they've got available to them. And you can definitely see a story that evolves from that, where they basically shelter themselves from the outside world and then try to use what's left to create something to help what's going on upstairs. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and almost any synchrotron, and especially the CERN Large Hadron Collider, which is what is like 27 kilometers long or something like that.
Yeah. That's
That's
huge.
a lot of resources. You can just think of the amount of metals, amount of
Oh,
wiring
yeah.
that's in there, all the resources that you have buried in there.
Yeah. You can envision a future where people are stripping it for parts. Seems to be what happens. That's like taking the trip we took where you see a lot of ruins of ancient Rome and
Mm,
ancient Greece, and we went to Egypt and saw the pyramids. You see what happens when those things, when they fall, people strip it for parts,
yeah.
and a lot of the good gets lost in the process.
And everything gets forgotten, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whoever's left standing writes history from that point forward, right?
Yes, no, that's true. And then they try to suppress any other stories.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we are about out of time. It's been great chatting with you. Before you go, perhaps you can let us know when you think your sequel might be ready and where we might find you online, if you'll be at any upcoming events or anything like that.
Well, so I'm about a quarter of the way through the sequel. And I think that as we go into the fall here, I'm going to have a lot more time to just sit and write. I'm actually writing, well, if you take the children's book, three books, but my trip prompted a book that just is very much like the first one. It's just coming out and it's
Excellent.
moving along at its own pace. But I think that by the end of the year, I'll have two more books, and one will be a sequel to this book. PaulYantus.com is probably the place to where I will post more immediate updates. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook and other places like that. I'm not on Twitter anymore. I couldn't take it anymore.
You
So,
lasted longer than me. I got to say, I left in 2011, to be honest. So I'm one of the OG departure.
I signed up for Blue Sky and I just can't do it. It's just too much noise. I prefer, I'm sadly limiting myself to friends and family.
Even then, I find it difficult because it feeds stuff in, doesn't it? You just can't escape whatever you're not wanting to see.
I tried to skip looking at my news feed while I was on holiday and I couldn't do it. I have to know what's going on in the world. whether I want to or not. I still need to know.
Well, you can use the excuse that it feeds your science fiction.
Yes, my biggest challenge is I want to give readers the science part of the fiction, which has taken me down a number of different paths. But when you want the science to be based in today's reality, you look for angles that people haven't done. A lot of it's been done. There's a lot of good writers out there.
A lot, yes. That's who we're competing
Yeah.
against, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, Paul Yantus, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.